He wasn't meant to be found. Not after 20 winters had buried the truth beneath layers of silence and snow. Not after the forest had learned to keep secrets the way men sometimes do, deep and undisturbed. But that morning the wind moved differently, slow and deliberate, threading through the pine trees like a whisper that refused to fade, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes felt it before he saw anything. A strange stillness in the air that pressed against his chest with quiet insistence as his boots sank into nearly 2 feet of fresh powder, each step muffled, swallowed by the vast white expanse stretching across the remote stretch of forest just outside the old training perimeter. The kind of place maps barely remembered and radios struggled to reach. The kind of place where time folded in on itself and left things behind. And beside him moved Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a dark sable coat dusted in frost. His breath rising in soft clouds, his posture usually steady, alert, disciplined. But now there was something else in the way he carried himself, something tighter, something uncertain, and Daniel noticed it immediately because Rex did not hesitate, not in snow, not in darkness, not even under fire. Yet here, in the middle of a quiet forest under a pale winter sky, the dog slowed, then stopped completely, his body going rigid as if the ground beneath them had shifted in ways only he could understand, his ears angled forward, not toward a sound, but toward something unseen, something buried, and Daniel followed his gaze until he saw it too, just a shape at first, barely visible beneath the uneven blanket of snow, a small rise that didn't belong, too smooth to be natural, too deliberate to be random. And for a moment he thought it might be a fallen branch or a rock pushed upward by the freeze, but Rex let out a low, almost inaudible whine, the kind he only made when something didn't make sense, and that was when Daniel felt it, not fear, not yet, but a quiet tension settling into his bones, the kind that comes when instinct brushes against memory, when something familiar lingers just out of reach, and he stepped closer, each footfall deliberate now, slower, the forest around him holding its breath, no birds, no distant movement, only the soft whisper of wind dragging across frozen ground. And when he knelt, brushing away the top layer of snow with gloved hands, the cold bit through instantly, sharp and immediate, but he barely noticed because beneath that thin crust of ice was not stone, not wood, but metal, dull and weathered, curved in a way that suggested purpose. And he froze there for a second, staring, trying to place it, trying to understand why something man-made would be resting here, hidden, forgotten, and Rex moved closer, pressing in beside him, his nose hovering inches above the exposed surface, not touching, just hovering, as if even he wasn't sure what he was sensing. And then Daniel brushed away more snow, faster now, revealing a larger section, enough to see the edge of what looked like a panel, maybe part of a vehicle, though it made no sense. There were no records of anything being left out here, no reports, no incidents, nothing that matched what he was seeing. And yet there it was, silent and patient, as if it had been waiting, and Rex suddenly stepped back, just one step, but enough for Daniel to notice, his muscles tightening, his tail stiff, not in aggression, not in fear, but in recognition. And that was the part that unsettled him the most, because recognition meant connection, and connection meant this wasn't random. This wasn't just debris carried by time. This was something that belonged to a story that hadn't ended the way it should have. And as the wind picked up again, weaving through the trees with a low, mournful tone, Daniel felt the weight of that realization settle in, heavy and unshakable, like something long buried was beginning to surface not just beneath the snow, but inside him too. And he glanced down at Rex, who now stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the exposed metal, breathing slower, deeper, as if listening to something beyond sound. And for the first time since they stepped into that forest, Daniel hesitated, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because he understood, in a way he couldn't explain, that whatever lay beneath that snow had been waiting far too long to be found, and once uncovered, it wouldn't simply return to silence. Before we begin, tell me where are witching from. Drop your country in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Daniel did not speak right away, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment did not belong to words, it belonged to listening, and he had learned a long time ago that silence often carried more truth than noise. especially in places like this where the forest seemed to remember things people tried to forget. So he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving his body in a steady stream of white vapor as he leaned forward again and brushed more snow away from the exposed metal, each movement careful, deliberate, as if he were uncovering something fragile rather than something long frozen and forgotten. And the more he cleared, the more the shape revealed itself, not random, not broken debris, but structured, intentional, a panel with edges too straight to be natural, the faint outline of what could only be part of a vehicle door. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, because vehicles did not just end up here, not this far into restricted terrain, not without someone knowing, not without a record. And yet there had been nothing, no mention, no memory, just empty lines where a story should have been. And behind him the wind shifted direction, cutting through the trees with a low hum that seemed almost human in its tone. And Rex moved again, not forward this time, but circling slowly, his nose close to the ground, tracing an invisible path around the mound as if mapping something buried deeper than metal, his paws pressing lightly into the snow, leaving sharp impressions that filled quickly as flakes drifted down from branches above. And Daniel watched him, studying the way the dog moved, because Rex was not searching randomly. He was following something specific, something that had a pattern, and that pattern did not belong to nature. It belonged to memory. And when Rex stopped again, a few feet to the left of where Daniel knelt, he lowered his head and let out a soft, uneven breath, the kind that carried hesitation, not fear. And Daniel felt that same hesitation echo inside his chest, a subtle tightening that made him pause before shifting his weight and moving toward the spot Rex had marked. And as he reached out, his glove brushed against something smaller beneath the surface, something solid but not as large as the metal panel. And he cleared the snow more carefully this time, slower, revealing the edge of an object that caught the faint gray light filtering through the clouds, a dull metallic sheen that had been worn down by years of exposure. And when his fingers closed around it, lifting it free from the frozen ground, he felt the cold seep through instantly, sharper than before, as if this piece carried more than just the temperature of the forest. And he turned it slightly, angling it to see past the frost. And for a moment his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing, because the shape was unmistakable. A military identification tag, worn, scratched, the chain long gone, but the form still intact, still carrying the quiet authority of something that once belonged to a name, a life, a story. And he brushed it gently with his thumb, clearing away the thin layer of ice that obscured the surface, and the letters began to appear one by one, uneven but legible, stamped deep enough to survive time. And Rex stepped closer again, his presence steady now, his earlier hesitation replaced by a focused stillness, as if he understood the importance of what Daniel held even before Daniel fully did. And then the name came into view, not all at once, but slowly, as if the forest itself were revealing it piece by piece. And Daniel felt his breath catch, just slightly, just enough to break the rhythm he had been holding. Because there are moments when recognition does not arrive gently. It arrives like a quiet shock, subtle but undeniable. And as he stared at the tag in his hand, the world around him seemed to narrow, the distant trees fading into the background, the sound of wind dulling into something far away, leaving only the weight of that single object and the name etched into it. And Rex let out a low sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something in between, something that carried understanding without needing explanation. And Daniel closed his hand around the tag for a moment, gripping it tighter than necessary, as if grounding himself in its reality, before slowly opening his fingers again, his eyes fixed, his thoughts beginning to shift from confusion to something deeper, something more personal. Because this was no longer just a discovery, it was a connection. And connections like this did not happen by chance, not out here, not after so many years. And as he looked back at the partially uncovered metal structure beneath the snow, the sense of unease he had felt earlier began to change, evolving into something sharper, something more focused, like the edge of a truth waiting just beneath the surface. And he knew then, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever lay buried here was not simply lost, it had been left, and the difference between those two things was everything. The name did not settle easily in his mind. It did not slide into place the way most things did after years of training. Instead, it lingered, heavy and unmoving, like a door that refused to open all the way, and Daniel remained there for a moment longer than necessary, the cold pressing through his gloves as he turned the tag slightly in his hand, studying the worn edges, the faint scratches that time had carved into its surface, each mark a quiet reminder that this had not been lost yesterday. Not even last year. This had been here long enough for the forest to claim it as its own, and yet Rex did not treat it like something forgotten. He treated it like something remembered, and that difference mattered. So Daniel slipped the tag carefully into the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, not out of habit, but out of instinct, as if proximity might offer clarity. And then he turned his attention back to the metal structure still half buried beneath the snow, its shape clearer. Now that his mind had shifted from uncertainty to purpose, and he began clearing more of it away, using both hands now, faster but still controlled, revealing more of the surface with each motion, until the curve of the panel connected to another, and then another, forming a larger outline that confirmed what he had already suspected. This was not just a piece. It was part of something whole, something that had once moved, once carried weight, once existed beyond this silent forest, and Rex moved alongside him, no longer circling but staying close, his body angled toward the structure, his eyes scanning not the distance but the details, the small changes in texture, the faint disturbances in the snow that Daniel might have missed if not for the dog's quiet insistence. And when Daniel brushed away another layer near what appeared to be the lower edge, his glove struck against something harder beneath, a different texture, smoother, and he paused again, adjusting his position to get a better angle, the snow giving way reluctantly as he uncovered what looked like the edge of a window, clouded over with frost, opaque from years of exposure, but unmistakable in its shape. And that was when the realization deepened, not just a vehicle, but one that had been sealed, enclosed, left intact rather than scattered, which meant this was not debris from an accident carried by weather. This was something that had remained exactly where it was placed, and that thought tightened something in his chest, subtle but firm, because placement implied intention, and intention implied choice, and choices like that did not happen without reason, and Rex let out another low sound, softer this time, almost like a breath he could not hold back, and Daniel followed his gaze to the side of the structure where the snow seemed slightly more compacted, as if something had once pressed against it from within, not recently, not enough to break through, but enough to leave a memory in the surface. And Daniel hesitated again, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he was beginning to understand, because this was no longer just about what they were uncovering. It was about what had happened here, and the two were not the same. And as he reached out to clear more of the window, his movements slowed, deliberate again, revealing just enough of the glass to catch a faint reflection of the gray sky above, and beneath that reflection, something else, a darker shape, indistinct but present, and he leaned in slightly, narrowing his eyes, trying to separate shadow from substance. But the frost held its ground, refusing to give clarity easily, and Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's arm, a quiet reassurance that he was not alone in this moment, that whatever lay beyond that thin barrier of glass was something they would face together. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steadying him as he shifted his weight and reached for the edge of the door panel, testing it gently, not expecting movement after so many years, but needing to know, needing to feel the resistance. And for a second nothing happened, just the stillness of frozen metal meeting gloved hands. But then there was the faintest give, almost imperceptible, like something deep within the structure acknowledging his presence, and Daniel froze, his grip tightening slightly as his eyes flicked to Rex, who had gone completely still again, every muscle in his body focused, every sense sharpened, and in that shared silence, with the wind holding its breath and the forest standing watch, Daniel understood one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one that had been waiting far too long to be told. Daniel did not pull harder right away, because force was not what this moment required. It required patience, the kind that listens before it acts. So he loosened his grip slightly and adjusted his position, planting his boots deeper into the snow to steady himself as the cold air pressed in around him, the quiet of the forest now feeling heavier, more watchful. as if something unseen had shifted the moment that metal responded to his touch, and Rex remained still beside him, not restless, not anxious, but focused in a way that felt almost deliberate, his eyes fixed on the seam of the door, his ears angled forward, catching something Daniel could not hear, and that alone was enough to slow Daniel's breathing, to remind him that whatever lay beyond this frozen barrier was not just an object, it was an answer, and answers like this did not come without weight. So he exhaled slowly and tried again, this time applying steady pressure, not pulling, but easing the door outward inch by inch. And at first there was resistance, the kind that comes from years of ice and silence holding something in place. But then there was a faint shift, a subtle release that traveled through the metal into his hands. And the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, drawn-out creak, like something waking up after a long sleep. And that sound carried through the trees in a way that made the entire forest feel like it was listening. And Daniel paused again, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this was the point of no return, that once the door opened fully, whatever remained hidden would no longer belong to the past alone. It would become part of the present, part of him. And Rex took one slow step forward, closing the distance, his shoulder brushing against Daniel's leg, a quiet gesture that did not need explanation, and Daniel nodded once, almost to himself, before continuing, the door giving a little more this time, enough to create a narrow gap. And from that gap came a faint rush of air, colder than the outside, still and untouched, carrying with it a scent that was difficult to place, not decay, not anything sharp or alarming, but something older, something that felt like time itself had been sealed inside and was now slipping free. And Daniel leaned slightly, just enough to look through the opening, his eyes adjusting to the dimness beyond. And at first there was nothing, just shadows layered over shadows, the interior swallowed by years of darkness. But then shapes began to form, outlines emerging slowly as his vision settled, and he could see the inside of the vehicle now, the seats stiff and unmoving, the dashboard cracked but intact, everything frozen in a moment that had never been completed. And Rex lowered his head slightly, peering into the gap as well, his breathing steady but deeper now, as if processing something that went beyond sight. And Daniel reached up with one hand, wiping a section of the frost from the window to let in more light, the motion revealing more of the interior with each pass. And that was when he noticed it, not immediately, but gradually, a detail that did not belong to the stillness, a shape positioned near the door, close enough to suggest intention, and he leaned in a fraction more, his heart slowing, not racing, because this was not fear, this was recognition building in quiet layers. And as the light shifted, catching the edge of that shape, he saw it clearly, a gloved hand resting near the handle, not reaching, not clawing, just resting, as if the person who had been here had made a final decision to stop trying. And that realization did not hit him all at once. It settled into him slowly, like the snow itself, covering everything with a calm that felt heavier than panic ever could. And Rex let out a low breath, his body still steady, his presence grounding, and Daniel did not move for a moment. He did not speak, because there was nothing to say that would not break the quiet truth of what he was seeing. And instead he reached out carefully, his hand hovering near the edge of the door, and pushed it open just a little more, enough to let the light fall fully across the interior. And in that pale winter glow, the scene revealed itself not as something violent or chaotic, but as something still, something resolved in its own silent way. And Daniel understood then, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was not just a place where something had ended, it was a place where someone had waited. And waiting, he knew, was sometimes the hardest part of all. Daniel did not reach inside immediately, because something about the stillness of that interior demanded a different kind of respect, not fear, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, as if crossing that threshold meant stepping into a moment that had been held in place for years without interruption. And he understood, in a way that did not require explanation, that whatever had happened here had settled into a quiet order, one that should not be disturbed without care. So he rested his hand lightly on the edge of the door, feeling the cold metal beneath his glove, grounding himself before leaning in just enough to study the details more closely. And as his eyes adjusted further, the scene sharpened, not into something chaotic or alarming, but into something deeply human, something intentional, and Rex shifted beside him, lowering his head slightly, his presence steady but attentive, as if he too recognized that this was no longer about discovery. It was about understanding, and Daniel's gaze moved slowly across the interior, taking in the placement of each object, the position of the seat, the angle of the dashboard, the faint outline of a pack resting on the passenger side. Time, the way the metal had dulled but not broken, and Rex stepped closer again, his nose hovering near Daniel's hand, not touching, just sensing, and Daniel took a slow breath before opening the box, the lid giving way with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet of the forest. And inside, there was no clutter, no random collection of items, just a single folded piece of paper, carefully placed, its edges worn but intact, and Daniel felt something shift inside him at the sight of it, because paper does not survive like metal does. It does not endure years of exposure without intention, without protection, which meant this had been preserved, kept safe, meant to last, and he unfolded it slowly, his hands steady despite the weight building in his chest, and as the paper opened, the writing revealed itself, faded but legible, each line carrying a clarity that time had not erased, and he read the first words in silence, his eyes moving carefully across the page, absorbing each sentence not just as information, but as something more personal, something directed, and as he read, the forest seemed to fade further into the background, the wind softening, the cold becoming distant, leaving only the quiet presence of the words before him, and Rex remained beside him, still and steady, as if standing guard over a truth that had finally begun to surface. And Daniel understood then, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that this was not just a message left behind, it was a voice that had waited, patiently, for someone to listen. Daniel read the first line twice before it truly settled, not because the words were unclear, but because they carried a weight that did not belong to the present. It belonged to a moment that had been lived fully and then sealed away, waiting for someone else to carry it forward. And his eyes moved slowly across the page, taking in each sentence with careful attention, the handwriting steady, deliberate, not rushed, not frantic, but composed in a way that spoke of someone who had made peace with time, even as it slipped beyond reach. And the message did not begin with explanation. It began with acknowledgement, as if the writer had already accepted that whoever found this would not be a stranger for long. And Daniel felt that connection forming with every word, quiet but undeniable, the kind that bypasses logic and settles directly into instinct. And Rex remained close, his head lowered slightly, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that this moment was not just about reading, it was about receiving. And Daniel continued, the words unfolding like a path that had been hidden beneath snow for years, revealing not just what had happened, but why it had been left behind. And there were no accusations written in anger, no desperation pressed into the ink, only clarity, only a steady recounting of choices made under pressure, of trust placed where it should not have been, of a decision to remain when leaving might have been easier. And Daniel felt his grip tighten slightly on the paper as the meaning settled deeper. Because this was not a story of something that had gone wrong by chance. This was a story shaped by intention, by people, by moments that could not be undone. And yet the tone remained calm, almost reflective, as if the writer had chosen to leave behind not bitterness, but truth. And that choice carried its own kind of strength, one that Daniel recognized in a way he could not ignore. And as he reached the middle of the page, his breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of focus, because the words shifted then, becoming more personal, less about what had happened and more about what had been understood in the time that followed. And there was a line, simple, unadorned, that made him pause, not because it was complex, but because it was direct, and in that simplicity it carried more weight than anything before it, a line that spoke of waiting, not as a burden, but as a choice, a decision to remain present even when the outcome was no longer in reach. And Daniel felt that line settle into him with a quiet force, because he knew that kind of waiting he had lived it in different forms, in different places, moments where time stretched and decisions narrowed until only one path remained. And Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, his shoulder firm against Daniel's leg. grounding him in the present as the past unfolded in his hands, and Daniel continued reading. The final lines approaching not with urgency, but with intention, each word placed as if it mattered exactly where it landed. And when he reached the end, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final plea, just a closing thought, steady and clear, a request not for action, but for understanding. And Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lingering on the last line as the meaning settled fully, not just in his mind, but in his chest, in the quiet space where instinct and memory meet. And for a moment he did not move, he did not speak, because the forest around him seemed to absorb the weight of that message, the wind softening, the trees standing still, as if even the world itself recognized that something long held had finally been heard. And Rex lifted his head just slightly, his eyes meeting Daniel's, not questioning, not searching, but steady, present, and in that shared stillness Daniel understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not just about uncovering the past, it was about deciding what to carry forward from it, and that decision, he knew, would shape everything that came next. Daniel folded the paper slowly, not out of hesitation but out of care, aligning its worn edges with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, as if returning it to the metal box was not just an action but a promise. And he placed it back exactly as he had found it, closing the lid with a quiet click that seemed to seal more than just the container. It sealed the moment, preserving it in a way that honored the voice that had waited so long to be heard. And for a few seconds he remained still, his gloved hand resting lightly on the box, his gaze lowered, not searching, not questioning, just holding the weight of what he now carried inside him. And beside him Rex shifted, not impatient, not restless, but grounded, his presence steady and unwavering, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet anchored everything around it. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled stream as he placed the box back where it had been, not deeper inside, not hidden, but exactly where it belonged, within reach, within sight, as if acknowledging that some things are not meant to disappear again, only to be understood differently. And when he withdrew his hand, he did not rush, he did not pull away sharply. He let the moment close gently, like a door that no longer needed to be forced. And then he shifted his focus back to the interior, taking in the stillness one more time, the quiet arrangement of everything as it had been left. And there was a calm there now that had not been present before, not because anything had changed physically, but because the meaning behind it had settled into place, and that changed everything. And Rex stepped forward, just slightly, lowering his head near the threshold of the open door, his nose close to the cold air that lingered inside. And for a moment he stayed like that, unmoving, as if listening, not for sound, but for something deeper, something that could not be heard but could still be felt. And Daniel watched him, understanding that this was Rex's way of acknowledging what had been, of recognizing the presence that no longer remained yet still held space in this frozen moment. And after a few seconds Rex lifted his head again, his posture easing, not completely, but enough to signal that whatever tension had guided them here had shifted, had reached a point of quiet resolution. And Daniel nodded faintly, more to himself than to the dog, before reaching forward, to gently push the door back toward its frame, not closing it fully, just enough to restore its shape, to return it to the stillness it had held for so long. And as the metal moved, the sound it made was softer now, less strained, as if even the structure itself had released something it no longer needed to carry, and the gap narrowed until only a thin line of shadow remained, a reminder rather than an opening. And Daniel stepped back then, his boots pressing into the snow with a firm, deliberate weight, creating distance not out of avoidance but out of respect, giving the place the space it deserved. And he reached into his jacket, retrieving the identification tag once more, holding it in his hand as he looked down at it, the name still clear despite the years. And this time when he read it, it did not feel distant. It did not feel like something separate from him. It felt connected, grounded, as if the story it belonged to had extended just enough to reach him where he stood. And Rex moved to his side again, sitting now, his body aligned with Daniel's, his gaze forward, calm and steady. And for a moment they remained like that, not speaking, not moving, just present, two figures, standing in the quiet aftermath of something that had finally been uncovered, and the forest around them seemed to settle as well, the wind easing, the branches still, as if acknowledging that whatever had been hidden here had now been seen, not exposed, not disturbed, but understood, and Daniel closed his hand gently around the tag, his grip firm but not tight, as if holding onto it was not about possession but about remembrance, and he lifted his eyes to the line of trees ahead, the path they had taken now partially obscured by the fresh fall of snow, the world already beginning to reshape itself around what had just occurred, and he knew then, with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken aloud, that leaving this place would not mean leaving it behind, because some discoveries do not end when you walk away. They stay with you, shaping the way you see what comes next. And as he took a step forward, Rex rising smoothly beside him, there was no urgency in their movement, no rush to return, only a steady, measured pace that matched the rhythm of something deeper, something that had shifted not just in the forest, but within him, and in that shift, there was not closure, not entirely, but something close enough to guide him forward. The path back should have felt familiar, but it did not in the way it had before, because something in Daniel had shifted with each step away from the buried vehicle, as if the weight he carried now was not physical but directional, guiding the way he moved through the forest with a quieter awareness, and Rex stayed close at his side, no longer scanning ahead with urgency, no longer pulling slightly at the lead the way he sometimes did when tracking. Instead, his pace matched Daniel's perfectly, steady and measured, like the two of them were moving through something that required understanding rather than pursuit, and the snow beneath their boots continued to fall softly with each step, the sound muted, absorbed by the vast white stillness that stretched between the trees, and for a while neither of them broke that silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had become part of the story, something that needed to be carried just as much as the words Daniel had read moments earlier, and the wind, which had once moved sharply through the branches, now softened into something almost gentle, weaving through the forest in long, slow breaths that seemed to follow rather than lead. And Daniel reached up briefly, adjusting the collar of his jacket as the cold pressed lightly against his neck, not harsh, not biting, just present, grounding, and his mind moved through the details of what he had seen, not replaying them with urgency, but placing them carefully, one beside the other, forming a quiet understanding that did not demand resolution, only recognition. And that was when Rex stopped again, not abruptly, not tense, but with a calm stillness that drew Daniel's attention immediately, and he turned slightly, following the dog's line of sight to a narrow opening between the trees where the snow lay undisturbed, smooth and untouched, and for a moment Daniel thought it was nothing more than a break in the forest, a shift in the terrain. But Rex remained focused, his ears forward, his body still, and Daniel stepped closer, his boots pressing deeper into the snow as he approached the edge of that clearing. And as he looked down, he noticed something subtle, something that would have been easy to miss without the stillness of the moment guiding his attention, a faint line beneath the snow, not deep, not recent, but present, like a path that had once existed and had been slowly covered over time. And Daniel crouched slightly, brushing away a thin layer of snow with his glove, revealing just enough of the ground beneath to confirm what he was seeing, a shallow track, narrow, leading away from where they had come, disappearing into the trees ahead, and his breath slowed as he studied it, because it did not belong to the present. It was too softened, too incomplete, shaped by time rather than by fresh movement. And Rex stepped forward once, placing his paw gently near the edge of that track, not disturbing it, just acknowledging it. And Daniel understood then that this was not a path meant to be followed in the way a trail would be. It was a path meant to be seen, a continuation of the story they had uncovered, not through objects, not through words, but through the quiet imprint of something that had moved through this place long ago. And he straightened slowly, his eyes tracing the direction of the faint line as it disappeared into the forest, and for a moment he considered it, not as a command, not as an obligation, but as a possibility. And Rex looked up at him then, his gaze steady, not urging, not questioning, just present, and Daniel felt the weight of that choice settle into him. The understanding that not every truth needs to be followed to its end, that sometimes seeing it is enough, and he let out a slow breath, the air drifting upward and fading into the cold, before placing his hand lightly against Rex's shoulder, a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could, and together they turned slightly, not away from the path, but forward, choosing direction not out of avoidance, but out of intention, and as they moved again, the forest seemed to accept that choice without resistance, the trees standing still, the wind soft, the snow continuing its slow, steady fall, covering the faint track once more, not erasing it, but returning it to the quiet place where some stories are meant to rest, not forgotten, not lost, but held in a way that does not require constant uncovering. And Daniel walked on, the tag still in his pocket, the weight of it no longer heavy, but steady, like something that had found its place within him, and Rex moved beside him, calm and certain, as if the purpose that had brought them here had now settled into something quieter, something lasting. And in that quiet, Daniel understood that what they had uncovered was not just a secret hidden beneath snow, but a truth that had chosen its moment to be seen, and now, just as gently, it was choosing to rest again. The forest did not end when the trees began to thin. It simply softened, opening into a wider stretch of land where the snow lay smoother, untouched by branches above, reflecting the pale afternoon light in a way that made everything feel quieter, almost distant, and Daniel slowed his pace slightly as he stepped into that open space, not because he was tired, but because something about the transition invited reflection, the kind that does not interrupt but settles in gradually, like the steady fall of snow that continues whether you notice it or not. And Rex walked beside him with the same calm rhythm, his head level, his ears relaxed, no longer searching, no longer listening for something hidden, just present. And that presence, steady and unwavering, grounded the moment in a way that made everything else feel clear. And Daniel reached into his jacket again, his fingers finding the familiar shape of the identification tag, and he pulled it out slowly, holding it in his palm as he stopped for a moment, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh layer beneath him. And he looked down at the name once more, the letters worn but still strong, still carrying meaning despite the years. And this time there was no hesitation in his gaze, no searching for understanding, only acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of a story that had been left behind not to be forgotten, but to be found by someone who would know what to do with it. And Daniel closed his hand gently around the tag, before kneeling, brushing aside a small patch of snow with care, revealing the earth beneath, dark and solid, untouched by the wind for a moment. And he paused there, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention, because actions like this were not rushed, they were chosen. And he placed the tag down carefully into the shallow space he had cleared, not burying it deeply, not hiding it, but returning it to the ground in a way that felt right, as if it belonged not in his pocket, not carried forward, but held in the place where its story had been completed. And Rex stepped closer, lowering himself slightly, as if understanding the significance of the gesture, his gaze steady, his presence quiet. And Daniel covered the tag with snow again, smoothing it gently with his gloved hand, not erasing it, but allowing it to rest, to return to the stillness it had come from. And as he stood, the wind moved lightly across the open space, lifting a thin veil of snow that drifted over the spot, blending it back into the landscape until it was indistinguishable from everything around it. And Daniel took a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs before leaving in a soft cloud. And he looked out across the clearing, the horizon stretching just far enough to remind him that there was always more beyond what could be seen, more paths, more stories, more moments waiting quietly for their time. And he felt something settle within him then, not closure in the way people often expect, but something steadier, something that did not require final answers, only acceptance. And Rex rose smoothly beside him, his posture aligned once more with Daniel's, ready to move, not because there was something left to find, but because it was time. And Daniel nodded slightly, more to the moment than to the dog, before taking a step forward, his boots pressing into the snow with quiet certainty. And together they walked toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees waited once more, tall and silent, holding their place as they always had. And as they passed into the shadow of the forest again, the light behind them softened, the open space fading from view, leaving only the path ahead, steady and unbroken, and Daniel did not look back. Not because he was leaving something behind, but because he understood that some things do not need to be revisited to remain meaningful. They stay with you in quieter ways, shaping the way you move forward, guiding without demanding. And as the forest closed around them once more, the sound of their steps blended into the natural rhythm of the world, the wind, the snow, the distant hush of branches shifting overhead. And in that quiet, there was no need for words, no need for explanation. Only the understanding that sometimes the smallest act of care, the simplest choice to see and to honor, is enough to carry a story from silence into something that endures, not in memory alone, but in the way it changes the one who finds it. And as they continued on, Daniel felt that change not as a burden, but as a quiet grace, something steady, something real, something that would remain long after the snow had fallen again and the forest had returned to its endless, patient watch. In a remote snow-covered forest, a U.S. Marine and his loyal German Shepherd K9 uncover a long-buried mystery that has silently waited beneath layers of time and ice. What begins as a routine patrol slowly transforms into one of the most emotional animal stories you will ever experience, where instinct, memory, and quiet truth guide both man and dog towards something far deeper than a simple discovery. As the Marine follows his K9's unusual behavior, they reveal a hidden vehicle frozen in place, untouched for decades, leading to a carefully preserved message that speaks not of fear, but of acceptance, patience, and the unseen bond between duty and humanity. Through this powerful journey, the Marine and his K9 move beyond investigation into understanding, showing how animal stories can reflect not only loyalty, but also emotional intelligence that transcends words. The forest itself becomes a silent witness to a story that was never meant to be lost, only waiting for the right moment to be found, reminding us that the strongest connections often come through trust and presence rather than explanation. This cinematic narrative blends mystery and emotional depth in a way that defines the essence of great animal stories, where a trained K9 does not just detect, but feels, guiding his partner through layers of hidden truth. As the Marine processes what he uncovers, the story shifts into a deeply human reflection on choice, time, and what it means to honor something without needing recognition, reinforcing why animal stories continue to resonate across audiences seeking meaning beyond action. The quiet resolution, marked by a simple act of respect, reveals that not all discoveries demand exposure, some only require understanding. And in that moment, both the Marine and his K9 embody the spirit of the most powerful animal stories ever told. This unforgettable journey highlights how loyalty, instinct, and compassion intersect in ways that redefine storytelling, proving once again that the heart of all great animal stories lies not in noise, but in the silent miracles that change us forever.